Do you feel that the advent of AI in animation is a threat to animation itself?
Well, the abilities of the technology and the fact that it's developing so very fast, and the way we've seen it improve over even the past couple of years, the old ways of producing animation are literally at threat. But whether we work with that, whether we embrace that, if there is a way of us working with it as creative professionals, that is the bigger question. But AI is coming; it's already here. But I do think unless we are very careful, and the people who are in charge of AI are very careful and a bit more mindful about the impact on it on the industry, that it could be at existential threat. Yes, I do believe that. Which brings us to this episode subject, which is new technology.
Again. Hello, my name is Dave Osborne, and I've been a director for 30 plus years, and I am known for directing shows like Super Team 4, Nexo Nights, and Mr. Bean, the animated television series, which I've directed a number of episodes of.
Hello, I am Stuart Evans, and I have been a director for almost 30 years. And my biggest profile show has been the CG version of Bob the Builder, of which I directed 104 episodes and a feature. I've also directed another 16 shows in CG and in 2D, and still loving it, unfortunately.
Well, I'm glad to hear you're still enjoying it. I
I'm
think
glad
that,
someone is.
yeah,
Yes.
it's important that somebody does at least. And if it's only you, that's great.
Yeah, okay. I'll keep it all going.
One of the things that would be good to understand at this point is where we've come from. Because I feel that in understanding where we're possibly going, and I do think that's a question on a lot of people's minds, what's it going to look like, the future? I mean, I felt one of the things that was a really big game changer at the sort of not at the right at the beginning of my career, but quite early on in my career was the introduction of paint and trace using a program which was called Animo. It was, it was a revolution because it really brought computers into the production process. And up until that point, we still traced, although we scanned the drawings generally and Xeroxed onto the cells and painted them by hand. And there were teams of people that painted them by hand. And I worked on a television series called The Animals of Farthing Wood. And the first couple of series had been done traditionally, which meant that they'd been hand painted and hand traced and then taken to a rostrum camera and filmed. And the company that I worked for was very keen to introduce this technology. They'd been working with a company up in Cambridge that had developed it, and we're talking at sort of the beginning of the 90s. They brought this in for the third series that we did, and yeah, it revolutionized the process. I mean, first of all, the quality that we were able to get from it was incredible. You could do camera moves that perhaps could have only been done 50 years ago with a multiplane camera. Suddenly on a television series, we had access to things like blur and levels of detail that perhaps we didn't have before. Reflections that we could control and do things with. It was quite, yeah, it was quite a revolution in terms of the visual part of the craft. But also the team of people needed to do it was much smaller. We had a team, I think, of it was something like 13 people who worked on the actual Animo paint and trace side of it, and also the camera side, which we'd probably call compositing side. I think we still refer to it as camera at that point. If you needed a team of 30 people in order to paint and trace a television series, and suddenly you only needed perhaps 10 or 15 people to do the equivalent amount of work. That's a lot less people involved, and there's a lot less entry points into the industry as it was then, which, paint and trace used to be a traditional entry point for animation. That was a big change, and yet it's funny. I didn't feel the pressure like we do with when people talk about AI, and I suppose it's possibly because that feels like a lot more of an unknown at the moment, and I think that's what there's a problem with it for a lot of people.
You've given us a potted history of the past 25 years. Well, the start of it, that was,
Yeah.
and that was very much my experience when I first walked into an animation studio. And we are going to get a bit dinosaur-y here because we are going to be talking about the old days. But it's important for us to go back really not that far. I mean, we're not going back to the 1940s. I mean, this is the end of the 80s. When I started in animation, I walked into a small studio and there was 4 people in there, and the walls, there were shelves all around the upper part of the walls, and it was packed with jars, plastic jars of cell paint. And that particular smell of cell paint sticks with me now. And you go, oh, I wonder what color that is, because I know, and it was as we said before, mom and pop sort of operation, where it's, you draw it, you get a piece of cell, you put it on, you trace it, you flip it over, you paint it with paint, you put it on a drying rack, you wait for it to dry, and then you shoot it on a rostering camera. And that's where people say, oh my goodness, why does animation take so long? It used to take a lot longer. You think this takes long? Oh my goodness, this is literally weeks just to get a scene done. It is almost more of a craft that it was, because it was basic, because we were drawing with a pencil, which I'm holding in my hot little hand here, and a pencil sharpener. That's what we had. And then a brush. Look at all the props I've got. Yeah, brush. It wasn't pressing buttons. It was a real craft. And you said we weren't directly affected because we were in another department. We were already in animation. We'd moved from paint to trace. We'd already moved on a stage. We saw it as very useful and an absolute time saver, and so, well, this will really help us. All the changes in animation, in technology, as technology has come on in leaps and bounds, but it's been sort of incremental. I remember when I was actually animating and seeing what was being done on the computers, and I was actually dreaming of a day where I could draw directly onto a screen and then manipulate that. And I thought, well, that's so far away. But it really wasn't. And now in my hot little hand, it's a Cintiq screen, which I'm holding up. And that's again another game changer. We've gone from using the peg bar, which I have a peg bar right here. Looky, I saved it. That was my technology at the time. That was a favorite. So to get the job done better, this is what you needed. And then technology just did away with the pencils, did away with the peg bars. And that's where all these things that we're discussing are very different from the advent of AI, because they've been incremental changes. It's less an absorption of new technology as an absolute shift in how we think about how we do our jobs. Even as directors, right from the very top, what do? Do we just turn into prompters? It used to be, everyone's going to have to write code to work on computers. No, because it's easily accessible. But it's who knows how this is going to change in the next couple of years.
I mean, I wouldn't underestimate, there's other aspects as well that I think changed what we could do in terms of quality of making filmmaking. I mean, to me, one of those was, non-linear editing. But, this idea of editing on a computer. I mean, physically editing film was, you had to be extremely organized, because you had to keep all these clips of films that you all hung up in a bin. Literally, it was a bin with a cloth sack in it and a row of nails across the top on a frame, and you put it all up, and you would have it all organized like that, and you'd have to physically put this together. And if you wanted to trim something, you'd have to go in there and cut a few frames off, keep those frames, couldn't throw them away. You had to keep those frames, because if it wasn't right, you had to stick those back on, in order to, put back what you had in order to try something else, maybe. So, to me, I mean, tape, now I look back and at the point, there was a lot of editing done on tape in the 90s and until towards the end of the 90s, I would say. That was really, was it better? I don't think so. You had to have a lot of kit. And yes, the first early non-linear edit setups were expensive. Don't get me wrong, they were expensive. But what you could do with it already, I sat down at the very end of the 90s with the editor to work on a series, and I was astonished, how you could actually manipulate, the cut, and actually do things so quickly, really, relatively. And that's only got better, more comprehensive as a piece of tooling. It's fabulous.
Some of it is a time saver, but this is like the non-linear editing experience does help us.
I mean, I put a caveat again in that. Like Animo, it came at a cost to people. So there was still a process that still involved probably third parties. It has come at a cost. So,
Yeah.
I suppose what I'm preparing myself for, and probably, part of this discussion is that in terms of what's coming potentially, there will be a cost, and that cost will be people. Which people is, I don't know yet, and that's the bit that's difficult to judge, and maybe that's where we're heading in the conversation. But I think that's one of the aspects that we have to be mindful about.
Yeah, it's all very well welcoming new aspects of technology and saying, oh, this will make our lives so much easier. But yes, the dwindling number of of lives who will be improved, as to the ever growing number of lives that would just be sort of parked over there and sorry, you have to retrain because your job literally doesn't exist anymore. But it's not without precedent.
But this is really much more difficult to deal with in terms of what does the future look like, and where do we or anybody else fit into it? I think that's always a really difficult thing.
How much do we need to hold on to, quote, the old ways?
I think that's a good question. I'm going to sidetrack us slightly with a little example of something that I feel, whilst it doesn't completely answer this, I think it does give us a warning. And that's there's a marketing guy called Rory Sutherland who does a lot of YouTube clips, and some of you might have watched or seen some bits come through on your feeds. And one example he talked about was Kindles, basically electronic books. And they turned up, I think it was something like 15 years ago or so. And when he saw them, he thought, wow, this is it. You know, you can have one device and you can have all your books on there. You can download books. You don't need to go to a bookshop. Yet, we're still in a circumstance where you can still go and find a bookshop. There's still a bookshop in my high street up here. People still want a tangible, physical book. And that's because they didn't understand when that all came in, and he admitted it, he didn't get it at that time either. He thought, okay, this is a great device, it's just going to replace all of these things. But it doesn't. It doesn't replace the fact that we often give books as presents. And we use them as part of our home decor. How many video calls have you seen, on the news when you can see some politician, you can see all the autobiographies that he's written, and yet you're looking at them. You are actually seeing, oh, what's he written? Oh, you read Churchill, of course he has, They all have, Oh, he's read Edward Heath. That's interesting. That's a bit weird. Okay, Anne Wilson. Oh, he's obviously looked at the 1960s. We make judgments about what people have read. And, all of that aspect of it was something that they didn't understand at the very beginning with the Kindles. They thought they had a device that gave you everything that you wanted.
Yeah, I agree that it's that what we think of as advancements can take the soul.
There is something quite interesting is that, the biggest animation company in the world or certainly the most dominating one. I know there are others, as they would always say. Um, and that's Disney. Their logo is still based on the original person's signature. That's that Disney logo, that D, it's all based on a signature. It was to do with the idea of the hand of the artist. It was a signature.
Do you feel that there has been a loss of basic animation principles because of said technological advances, such as animating programs in particular, that can actually move something, but maybe not animate it in the illusion of life way that we were trained in?
So I think there became a whole different set of skill sets that came in. Um, in those processes, no, I don't think we lost basic principles of animation when we went from drawn animation into platforms like Cell Action or Harmony, or there are other ones, I know that there are, or going into the sort of 3D platforms where people began to animate characters. I think there were limitations in the early days of what you could do in those platforms, but the technology gradually went in the direction where people wanted it to go because, they said, well, we want to do this. We want to make the hair do something, have a little bit of overlap. And, somebody said, well, we can design these type of bones and we can do this with it. And suddenly you had a much more natural hair movement rather than it looking like it was going through the shoulder. All of these things, what we perhaps take for granted now, didn't exist 20 years ago. It was all things, the craft was actually solving those problems with the tools that you had. The clips and the shots that I look at now where I've seen something that's clearly been produced and made on an AI platform, it's you go to these things, they're generally web based, and you go in and you write a prompt and you get an 8-second film, some idea, and you go, oh, that's quite interesting, but it's not quite what I wanted. If I rewrite the prompt, maybe I'll get something else, and you get something that you want, but you lose something else that you liked, and it's a bit of a struggle. And I
Yeah.
don't know. I personally at the moment don't see that as the way forward. I see where those tools are going to come in are things like I know that Illustrator has got a tool that if you build a character in the vector-based system that they have in Illustrator, you can extrapolate a turnaround. And the tool will actually produce a turnaround, and I think you can determine how many positions on the rotation you want. And knowing from the experience I've had with shows that I've done on Harmony, that's a long process that takes an animator, or not an animator, but a designer to do. To take the basic design and go, okay, now I need to do these positions, because that's how you build the rig within those programs. You have multiple angles. If you've got a tool that can now do that or do a lot of the work of that, that's obviously a time saving.
Yeah.
From the tests that I've seen and the bits and pieces I've seen, there are still inaccuracies. There are still bits you go, okay, that shoulder's not quite right. You can see it's not right. But because it's vector based, you can go in and jump in there and do things. I can imagine, and I don't know whether this is happening because I haven't looked at it too closely. I can imagine some of the programs, the animation programs, you will be there as an animator, but your first step in a scene will be to write the prompt. And you might say,
Mm.
character XYZ walks across, you know, looking around from this point to this point. And the AI software will lay out the animation and you'll go, okay, those are the keys. Don't like that bit. Don't like that bit. I'm going to fiddle that bit. And you can go in and change it. Now, if that's something that could, if I can imagine people are thinking about those sort of tools at the moment, that would probably save time. And yet you would still need to understand the principles of animation. You would still need to know about weight because you might look at it and go, oh, the weight's not good on it at the moment. Do I need to rewrite the prompt? Or do I go in and start changing my in-betweens and correct it that way? The skill will evolve again. That's what I think will
Mm.
happen. So I
Yeah.
think that's one version of the future.
Mm.
I don't know how long that future would last for,
Yeah.
but equally that's a version of the future potentially.
the reason why I asked that question was that a few years ago, I was speaking to some animators who were straight out of college, and they were animating on a show, and they were having problems with a couple of scenes. And I had a look, and I said, do you want me to just comment? I think there is something that I'd like to suggest. And they said, oh yeah, fine. So I suggest, and I said, well, they said, well, there's something is wrong. Something is wrong with this. I said, oh yes, I can tell you exactly what I feel is wrong. And it was that the character walking across the room had no weight, and he dropped something, and it just sort of cushioned into the floor. I said, but he needs more weight. Well, how do we do? What do you mean? I said, well, look, act it out yourself. But when I was explaining this to these guys and saying, this is how you solve it, you take some out of that, some out of that, here's a timing chart, and they went, what's that? And it's old school stuff, I know that. I said, but this is quite a basic principle, and it's a good way of illustrating what you need to do. And they'd never seen that. They'd never seen that, which is fair enough. It's antiquated, but it worked. It was a principle, and it illustrated that very, very well. And I had to explain to them exactly what I meant and exactly how they could fix it. And they actually seemed ignorant of what the problem was. They couldn't see a problem, or they just sensed that there was something a little wrong.
And I think that does hook back a bit to the beginning of the conversation that we were talking about when tools like Animo came in, and then, eventually 2D platforms. You lost entry points into the industry where you had an opportunity to come in and you would, trace other people's drawings, or you paint other people's drawings, and you would see what worked and what looked good, and perhaps why something came back to your desk because it didn't work at another part of the process, at camera or whatever, for whatever reason. The same with in-betweening. If you stepped onto that part, the branch of the process to actually learn, you got to see other people's work. And I that was something when I was listening to you talk about the idea that the team that you were talking about didn't have the tool set or the craft tools to actually understand, okay, something's wrong. We need to look at the timing. They may still have struggled with it, not got it quite right, but they didn't know where to start to solve the problem. And I think that's the bit that we will have to be very wary about and very careful about, to actually sort of navigate with all of these tools that are going to come. All right. They are coming, as we will go into in a minute, I think, the turnaround tool that's in Illustrator, you will still need to understand what looks right. Why does that arm look wrong? What's something you are still going to have those basic skills that you might have obtained by doing life drawing and understanding anatomy on a human being, and being able to transfer that to a cartoon character.
Yeah.
So I think those things at the moment still, we're in a sort of gray area where we will need the skill sets that I think that we've currently still got. We will need to work out what the new entry points are going to be for people, because I think we have got a problem. I do think we've got a problem because of, the world that we live in, with everything remote, generally everything remote, and people coming out of college and trying to get work. And if they do get an opportunity, often that there isn't a depth of knowledge, or something that you can, be part of, that you think, okay, the guy over there has been doing it for 20 years. He understands exactly what he's doing, or that person, whoever it is. I think, we are in a world where it's all got a bit lost, the structure, and we don't quite know really what it should be, and even how to fix it. I think we're too busy trying to work out how to fix the financial side of the business at the moment, apart from anything else, and maybe we can't fix what we're describing until how we make money out of this again is worked out. Looking at, as AI can't be put back into the bottle, all right? You can't put the genie back into the bottle. You can't uninvent things. Do you feel it can be useful in animation and not just as an existential threat to the whole industry?
There are,
Where do you see
yeah,
it being? Okay, let's kind of list. Where do we think it can be useful at times as it exists at the moment?
it can be useful. I will say, I will fess up that I have used AI in coming up with, in giving me the seeds of show ideas. Very, very basic seeds. It was, the prompt that I gave it was two characters in a room. They're having an argument. What are they arguing about? And it gave me, I said, give me 10. And it gave me 10 in about 5 seconds. And I said, right, I can use about 3 of those. Give me another 10. And it gave me another 10. And I said, okay, I can get out of this, I can get 8. That's a nice seed. So from that seed, I then wrote scripts as a little initial kick. That's how I've used it so far. So far, that's how I've used it. So I feel in being the inspiration for seemingly random ideas. I feel that is very useful, and that's something that we can act on. In terms of in that same process, I would say it's not at the moment. It is not great for script writing. I don't think so. You can tell. You can tell at the moment where it's natural speech and where it's not. In terms of the visuals, I think we're on much trickier ground where I think it is a massive threat to the entire industry, because seeing even on Instagram, other platforms are available, but having a look on there and seeing some of the AI imagery that is produced, like short clips about like 3 or 4 seconds of glorious landscapes that would take months and months to create, and just seeing them move, and you went, wow, and your imagination is fired up, and that would have taken a few minutes. So I feel it can be useful in animation, in that it can give you unusual inspiration. But more than that, I feel that we will have to manage it and manage expectations, really, because the people with the money are seeing that animation is, as we've always known, a massive money pit. Because you may make some money out over this, but it takes a long time. It has been in the past massively labor intensive, which is why you saw studios leaving the UK and the animation being done in the Far East, because their cost of living was so much less, and you saved a whole load of money. And we understood that. We understand that now. But now, for the money people are saying, but why am I paying this team of 450 people when I can just get 3 people in a room to just give me a load of prompts, and what comes out of that is astonishing. And yes, it's soulless, but I don't care. The people with the money are not necessarily aware of what they're looking at, of what is quality. So we have to keep that flame of quality alive as much as we possibly can, and show what the human input can make as a difference to what AI can produce. But that's where we stand currently.
Yeah, okay. I think there is that perception in there that, at some point, writing a prompt, you'll just say, give me 90 minutes of a, you know, horror movie in a Stephen King style, and that's all you have to write. And um, yeah, I mean, I think there's also an element of people do. I can see that people will switch off from it, though. I don't mean it. I think it's a little bit like sort of people will sense when they're not being told a story firsthand. And most films at the end of the day, even when there's lots of visual effects or it's complex technical process, there is always that sense of the people in there that made the film. You get the individual performances of the actors, whether it's a voice in an animated film or whether it's an actual a visual performance. You get the selection of shots. You get the direct. You are directed through the story in some shape or form. And we criticize a story that's badly told by a human being. Oh,
Yeah.
that's a terrible film. It's too slow or it's too this or whatever. And what was the director thinking of? What were the creatives thinking at that particular time? So, whilst there's a novelty factor to it at the moment, um, and there's a wow factor, just as you described, because I've had the same experience. Like I say, I sort of hope in the best way that the tools come in and they aid us in the near future to be able to keep making things like, turnarounds or, maybe, it can do something where it can change the colors on something, as a process without having to go back in and opening. So I don't know, tools that are within tools, let's put it that way.
There is no way of telling the future with this because as we've seen with the changes, they have been incremental and they've been about having the right tools for producing the work and the job. And this AI advent is, it could sweep all that away. I'm hoping that it won't. There is always room for creativity. There is always a space for creativity.
I want to give you a little example, and this is not related to our business at all. And a friend of mine, probably about 4 or 5 months ago, he came round here and he was talking about what he was doing. And he does sort of renovation work. And he said, "Oh, I'm using AI now." And I went, "Oh, really?" And I'm thinking, this is a guy who works with his hands and, bits of paper and things. He said, "Yeah, yeah." He said, "What I do is I go into a room and I can go in and go, I read out the measurements that I need for something like putting in a partition wall, whatever it is, and he puts it all in and then he'll put it into one of these AI tools like Grok, I think he referenced to, and it'll come out and it'll give him a materials list, all done to the codes that he needs to use, pricing, and then it'll look for quotes." And he said it was revolutionary for him because obviously that was a lot of work that he was doing on his own, because he was a sort of one man operation type thing. So I think whilst these tools, so my reflection is whilst these tools can empower people at all sorts of levels, they could equally empower individuals as well.
Yeah.
So I mean, you've probably got through this chat, Stuart, I think a little sense of the time. I'm trying not to sort of look at all of this and go, this is the end of the world. Because like I said, I felt we'd been through phases of changes that we didn't necessarily understand, but actually were the end of parts of process that we liked, we valued. We still like the smell of cell paint. But I think that's something to keep in mind for people who are trying to navigate this, that there is as much potential for them as individuals, and I use that word carefully, in these tools to be able to do things and maybe able to make something. And with this world that we've got with lots of individual creators on platforms like TikTok or wherever it is, YouTube and everything else, and wherever else you want to go and find your creators from. I think that's something to keep in mind. It can be equally empowering for individuals as well as being a threat to your job. So I think that's the difficulty. That's the balance that we are current. That's the road we're on at the moment. Yeah.
Yeah, that's exactly the word that I was going to use, was empowering. So we've got to think it may be difficult, but we have to. We have no alternative but to approach it in a positive way and say, okay, let's see how we can make this work for us as creative people, and not just, oh my God, the sky's falling on our heads and it's the end of everything.
Just as you used it for making those story springboards.
Yeah.
You used that in a way. You then said, right, I've got something that'll give me some thoughts and ideas, and I've got these different avenues. There are positives, but there are also, like I say, there will be changes, and some of those won't be great. There will be roles and jobs and crafts that will disappear.
Yeah, we are not denying the terrible reality of this. We're just hoping to navigate a way through it, a positive way through it, in the hope that we can just continue creating as we've always done.
I think it's a subject that we'll probably find ourselves talking about again at some point, because I think it's around us at the moment in a big way. I hope this has been interesting for everybody listening, because I think that, you know, we've all got an opinion, we've all got a perspective on it, and we'd love to hear from any of you or what your perspective is on this particular subject, and maybe how you're trying to navigate it right now. So from me, I'll say thanks very much, and thanks for listening, and hopefully see you next time.
Yes, please, please do join in the conversation, because we are all one big community. We may be all around the world, but as we know, animation is a very, very small industry, and we're all in this together. So please, if you've liked this, like and subscribe to this channel. And as we've said before, remember, we are not saving lives.
It's only a cartoon.
See you next time.
Bye.
Bye.